As some of you may be aware, the physical version of Dungeons & Dragons Dark Alliance had been delayed to various dates but ultimately ended up releasing on July 2nd, 2021. For me, physical copies are a must. I do not buy digitally except for certain circumstances which I have talked about on this channel before. One of the biggest reasons for this is that if a game releases in a poor state or you simply don't enjoy it like you thought you would, you can sell the game and usually recoup a decent amount of your money. Unfortunately, D&D Dark Alliance seems to have fallen into that very situation, but is it as bad as people are saying? Well, that's what I'm going to try and attempt to answer for you in this review, but before we get into all that, as usual, it's only right to thank everyone who's been watching my videos, clicking all the buttons and leaving some really kind comments. It's genuinely really nice to see, and believe it or not, it really does mean a lot to me, so thank you very much. If you're not subscribed to the channel, I hope that this video will help earn your subscription today, and we're currently working towards 500 subs, so every single one of you that clicks that little red button is more important than you know. Now then, as usual with my reviews, I'll give you the factual information on what the game is, what it does, and what it's all about, and then I'll move on to my personal opinions on things I liked about the game, things I don't like about the game, and all of that. After that, I'll round everything up into a conclusion and let you know what my recommendation is based on various viewpoints, which should help you decide if this game is worth your time and money. A couple of things to note. Firstly, I played on a PlayStation 5. Secondly, I played everything solo and did absolutely zero co-op. And lastly, the game has had a patch since release, so the version that I played was not the same version that everyone else played on day one, but I will talk about that a little bit more during the review. So what is Dungeons & Dragons Dark Alliance? Well, it's a third-person looter slasher which, unsurprisingly, will have you doing a lot of hack and slash combat, leveling up, and of course looting gear. It was developed by a studio that I'd actually never heard of before called 2K Games, and that's not 2K as in the number 2 and the letter K, but 2K, spelt T-U-Q-U-E, and of course published by Wizards of the Coast. The game is structurally very similar to the PS5 launch game Godfall. For starters, it has a small hub area with a merchant and a map area where you pick your next mission. The missions and levels themselves are very similar with basic objectives and a few hidden loot areas, but overall, each level is a pretty straightforward A to B kind of journey. Even the combat is really similar. The only real difference is the camera. In Godfall, it's always behind you, sort of over the shoulder, whereas in D&D, your character is able to attack enemies in directions that the camera isn't facing, if that makes sense. You're also able to unlock and upgrade various consumables like health potions and firebombs. Your character can dodge, parry, and execute special abilities in pretty much the exact same way as they're performed in Godfall. So if you've played Godfall, or even just seen how it works, it's pretty similar and you'll probably find it quite familiar. You're able to play as 4 different named characters from the world of Dungeons & Dragons. There's a barbarian called Wolfgar, a dwarf named Brunor, a wood elf archer named Catti-Brie, and a dark elf who goes by the name of Drizzt. As I said, these are named characters, so there is no character creation here, unfortunately. There's not much really given to the player in the way of story, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. As you fight through the game, these characters will level up by gaining XP and of course acquiring loot, which you can equip to provide various bonuses and better stats. You'll also be able to unlock new moves and abilities as you progress. Once you've powered up a little bit, you can then go back and replay previously cleared levels at higher difficulties to acquire better loot and level up some more, which in turn will let you tackle even harder difficulties. It's a standard dungeon crawler loop, and honestly, that's about it for what the game actually is. There's not much more to it. So now with that stuff out of the way, I think we're going to move into personal opinion territory, which is where we'll talk about all the stuff I liked about the game. Everything in this section is based upon my own experiences with the game and shouldn't really be taken as facts. So firstly, I think that arguably the best part of the game is actually the visual presentation. Obviously, if you play this on a good 4K TV with HDR, then it's going to look even better than what you're seeing here. But overall, I think the art direction and environmental details are probably the game's biggest strength. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people prefer solid gameplay over incredible graphics, so this isn't really saying too much, but I do believe in giving credit where it's due. As with most games, there are a few things here and there that don't look that great, but overall I'd say it's very nice to look at. Looking up from the bottom of a valley to see hundreds of goblin houses built into the sides of it, with the light streaming down from behind them, it just looks really nice. And the only things that I noticed that weren't really up to par visually was a few muddy, blurry textures, which were mainly mainly on the character's gear, and these flags that you can see here that seem to be animated at 30 frames per second while the game is actually running at 60 frames per second, so it just looks kind of odd and sticks out, but again, it's a very minor thing. Another positive is related to performance. The game is confirmed to run at 4K 60 FPS on PS5, Series X, and PC, and from my experience, I only noticed a few frame drops in rare situations, when there was a lot going on, and other than that, I only had a few small visual glitches here and there, and only one instance of a progress blocking bug. It occurred on the last boss of the game, actually. The boss bugged out and became immune to all damage, but wouldn't move as it was scripted to do. I just had to restart the fight, and it worked fine the second time. I had no freezes or crashes whatsoever, but I've heard that the game is a bit more unstable on PC, so that's definitely something to be aware of. A lot of early reviews talk about how buggy and glitchy this game is, but I've not really had that experience or anything close to what's been said about it. The higher quality of stability that I personally experienced could be related to the patch that the game received since launch, so I think that would be something to keep in mind if you haven't bought the game yet. One small thing that I actually kind of liked was just the amount of stuff that you can find by simply poking around in the various corners of the levels. It doesn't spam you with gear like Diablo does, even though I quite like getting showered in loot, to be honest, but there's always something there when you look, perhaps behind a breakable wall or inside some wooden barrels or something like that. You always seem to find gold or a chest to reward you for your exploration, and I quite like that. A lot of different looter games often waste your time with sort of hidden areas that just have nothing in them, and while it's a very minor positive, I do appreciate it in a game like this. Lastly, the cutscenes seem very well made to me. I thought the voice actors played the parts really well, and the way that they're put together and filmed make them feel like they could almost be an animated TV show, kind of like they're small sections taken from a bigger movie or something like that. But for me, the cutscenes look great visually with great lighting and effects, while the sound is almost movie quality, and they were honestly the only part of the game that actually interested me in the characters and locations and stuff like that, so again, credit where credit is due. So now we really should move on to the negatives, and again, this stuff is all regarding my personal experience with the game. The biggest issue with this game for me is easily the combat. It's predominantly what the game is all about. I mean that and a bit of exploration and a little bit of inventory management. But I completely see and even feel when I control my character what they were going for. But in my opinion, I think it's flawed on a fundamental level. And what I mean by that is that the core programming and implementation of the combat system is just not polished enough. It feels very clunky and cumbersome to control when in combat, and when you consider how big a part of the game combat is, it just falls short. For example, it's common to feel like you've dodged an attack, at which point you go in for a counter and then you suddenly get knocked down and have no idea why. It seems to me that the hitboxes for enemy attacks are very wonky and often don't hit anywhere near where the enemy character model would suggest. And on top of that, the hitboxes seem to linger long afterwards as well. Another example would be when you attack, your character is locked into that direction and won't turn or deviate to hit other enemies, meaning that you need to kind of stop attacking and physically reposition your character facing the right way before attacking again. And that becomes very tedious, and I felt like it really broke the flow of combat. After a short while, the fighting started to feel more and more like a chore, and more about learning to work around the flawed programming and flawed animation, as opposed to fighting creatively in order to sort of topple a powerful enemy, if you see what I mean. To me, it wasn't fun to engage with enemies, and that leads me to my next negative point. As far as I can tell, enemies that you fight during a mission do not give you any XP, although if they do, it's a ridiculously small amount. The majority, if not all XP, is earned simply by completing the mission. This means that in some levels, you can literally run from start to finish and fight nothing but the boss and basically get as much XP as you would have by fighting for 30 minutes or more throughout the level. It's very weird, and considering how janky the combat feels to me, I was almost incentivized to ignore everything unless I literally had no choice. Sometimes the game puts up barriers and says that you must defeat certain enemies in order to progress, but other than that, you can simply run through everything, and it seems like the better choice a lot of the time. I played the entire game solo, but I've seen many people discuss the balance being absolutely broken. Now, as I said, I've had a patch which supposedly fixed some of it, so it may not have felt as bad to me as someone who played it on day one. However, once I hit the red levels on the map, there was still a huge difficulty spike that I instantly noticed. Minor enemies felt pretty much right most of the time, HP and damage wise, and that was when I fought through the first 4 areas, but once I reached the red levels on the map, everything was hitting me for maybe 5 times what they hit for previously, and at the same time starting to throw more and more enemies at me at once, plus multiples of some of the most annoying enemies in the game. All the way up until that point, I hadn't died, but all of a sudden everything was stun locking me and killing me really quickly. And I can only really imagine that the developers wanted us to go back and replay the earlier levels over and over in order to grind up to these red ones. But again, considering how the combat feels, I just simply didn't want to. Luckily for me, I chose Drizzt as my character, and I have no idea who he is, and after finishing the game I still don't have any idea who he is. But about halfway through the game, I heard that he was technically the best for solo play, as he is very unbalanced, or at least was very unbalanced and overpowered. After researching it a little bit, I can't even fathom how difficult and frustrating it would have been to play this game solo with any of the other characters. I mean, I honestly may have just given up, but I can't really say that for sure. I think I would have just preferred there to be a character creator because, I mean, you know, I'm no expert, but in D&D, the tabletop game, don't you generate your character at the start of a campaign, or you know, perhaps bring another character that you already have created from another campaign into a new one? I mean, do you ever play as heroes in the tabletop game, you know, like named ones? I literally don't know, but it just seems like an odd choice to me. Perhaps if you do know, you can let me know down below. Story-wise, I personally feel like the game does a very poor job of explaining the world, who these characters are, and why we should give a damn. I've heard Drizzt is kinda awesome in the lore, but I have no idea about any of it because it didn't really show me any of that. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of things that you can read about in the lore inside the game, and that's perfectly fine, but I would rather that they just showed me at least some of what I should know, and then had some deeper lore for people to read if they really wanted it, instead of it all just being in text. Of course, the cutscenes are great and everything, but they don't really tell you too much about what's going on. They do add flavor to the areas, definitely, but they don't really tell you much about progressing the plot or the narrative, unfortunately. And I think the loot system is fine, it's just very average. It's a typical by-the-numbers loot system, which sadly didn't have anything that really interested me in my entire playthrough. I think I maybe found, I don't know, 1 or 2 things that kind of look decent, but there was nothing really to write home about. It's not really an offensive system, like it's not horrible, it's just very basic, and in my view doesn't really do much to help the game overall. I also found the boss fights to be generally pretty underwhelming, just due to the fact that you can usually pop all of your abilities at once and basically stun lock them into oblivion. I believe that a few of them are just reused as well with different names, but I'm not 100% sure on that, as the names didn't really stick in my head at all. They just weren't very memorable to me. Perhaps they may have been famous named characters, but I don't really know because the game kind of assumes that you'll know or understand who all these enemies are and who all the characters are. I mean, I do get what's going on to some degree, but even though D&D is more popular than ever, it's still quite a niche hobby, I would say. I just don't think that many people will find anything interesting in this game, you know, something to keep hold of them and keep them engaged in the story and the world, and that's definitely a shame considering the vast amounts of lore and story that Dungeons & Dragons has over the years. It's a very old game, there's been a ton of stuff written about it, yet they kind of failed to present it to us here, which is very strange to me. And I think the last small thing to talk about is the fact that the game uses a stamina system for attacks. As I said, I played as Drizzt, and not a single time when I was playing did I ever run out of stamina. Not in any way, shape or form. So, you know, I've seen some of the other characters, Catti-Brie especially, runs out of stamina very, very quickly, and I just kind of feel they should have designed the combat a little bit better and not used stamina at all, because it's really superfluous. It doesn't do anything, and in fact, with some characters, it makes them actively worse to control, you know, worse to play as, so I just don't think it needed to be there. But that about does it for the main issues that I have with the game, and at this point I could go on about some minor little things here and there that I didn't like, or things that I would personally change, or perhaps elements that I would have done differently, but honestly I think it's time to move on to the conclusion. Video games, like most things in life, are subjective. People can and will disagree on what makes a particular game good. Sometimes though, you really need to just try and put your feelings aside, even if you like a game, and just accept that even though you personally enjoyed a game or found some measure of fun in it, the quality level just isn't up to par. And that's kind of how I feel about Dungeons & Dragons Dark Alliance. I was able to find some small bits of fun here and there were parts I liked. And I don't think the game is a disaster, but it is lacking in quality. I don't want to just throw it into the fire like so many others have done, but having said that, you can't deny that the game feels pretty bad to play. Can you find some enjoyment here? Yeah, you can, but every single moment of fun seems to be punctuated by the simple lack of quality. The game asks you to fight tactically, but the way your character moves and just the simple interactions between yourself and the enemies is just not good enough to achieve that. If you're someone who is a D&D fanatic or just someone who plays D&D quite often, I don't think I can recommend this game to you because I don't believe it does justice to your hobby. I don't think it brings the tabletop game to life in any way, and you would almost definitely be better off sticking to the tabletop game. And then if you're someone who's never played real D&D before but perhaps would like to and think that this game might be a good place to start, I would again suggest that you find some people to play the real tabletop game with. I hate to say this, but I think if you were to play this video game before the tabletop game, it might actually put you off of playing the real thing, and that would be a real shame. And of course, if you're just a general gamer and you just play whatever games look good to you and you don't really have any interest in D&D whatsoever, I would have to suggest that you skip this one for now. Perhaps down the line, pick it up if it's on a deep discount or something. I mean, I guarantee it will be on sale pretty soon. Maybe then it would be an okay way to kill an afternoon or perhaps a few evenings. So there you go, that's my review of Dungeons & Dragons Dark Alliance, and I think I can sum it up quite easily by just saying, if the combat had have been more fun to play, this could have been a decent little budget game. But as it stands right now, it's just too hard to recommend. But as always, let me know what you think about this game and this review in the comments section. Maybe leave a thumbs up if you liked the video, and if you're new to the channel, please do consider subscribing. Check out the online retro game store, Pyro Games. There will be a direct link in the description down below, along with a 10% discount code. But with all that said, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.